for the 13th of February. I'll get Tracy to open with the Karakia. Thank you, Tracy.
Morning, councillors. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. I aki ana te ati kura, i teo, i huka, i hauhu, ti hei mauri ora.
Thank you, Tracy. We haven't got an overly long agenda this morning, but there are some technical reports coming to us. So we have 4 decision items, which are items 1 to 4, and the rest are just our normal information items coming through. Lunch is scheduled for 12:30, so we'll leave it at that. Just a heads up for council is our April the 10th meeting in your calendar may well be shifted, so it's just an indication at this stage. It just clashes with the coastal plan hearings that Stu and I will be attending, so that'll take obviously the chair and the co-chair, the deputy chair out of the space. Apologies. So I currently have apologies for Pamela Story, Stu Kneebone, Angela Strange, and Jennifer Nicol for absence. Any others? I'd note that we have Robbie and Clyde online. We can have a mover for the apologies. Thank you, Councillor Clarkson, and seconded Councillor Hodge. All those in favour? Opposed? So carried. No doubt you'll all have spent the last few days reading through your agenda, so confirmation of the agenda. Thank you, Councillor Hughes. Thank you, Councillor Downard, second. All those in favour? Opposed? So carried. Reminding councillors, are there any declarations, disclosures of interest relating to any matters either new or on the agenda? So no, thank you. Health and safety statement. Sorry, Tracy. Yes.
Mr. Chair, just making members and staff aware, staff received a similar email that councillors received in terms of a deputation that Neville will represent WRC with this afternoon, the sovereign citizens. So just from a health and safety perspective, they are due in the building at 1. We anticipate that we'll be well done by then. Just in order to just maintain a bit of order down here on the bottom floor, you will need your fob to swipe in and out coming in through the chamber doors this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Right, so the first one up will be minutes for confirmation. And that's the Strategy and Policy Committee meeting that was held on the 26th of November. Certainly.
Why do we do that? Because I've asked this question at council. If we ratify the minutes at council, why do we do it again at the committee meeting? Because they've already been done at council. Or have these ones not been done at council?
Morning, everyone. This is a little bit of a convoluted answer, but I'll keep it brief. We've recently changed the system that we use to create the agendas, and it automatically pulls the minutes back to the committee that they originated from. But as Councillor Smith has rightly pointed out, they've already been confirmed by council. So it's just really a procedural matter for us just to keep it tidy. Those minutes are there for reference only. The system that we're using is still being refined and debugged, and we'll take a position in consultation with the chair in due course on that about whether the minutes should return to the originating committees for confirmation, or whether we'll continue the practice with them going to council.
Could I just, if they've already been confirmed, they can't be reconfirmed, should they?
No, you're only receiving them.
Okay. All right, thank you.
So you're happy to move that, Councillor Smith, that we receive?
Noting that they've already been confirmed.
Thank you. And the seconder, thank you, Councillor Clarkson.
It's just, you know, getting it right.
No, 100%. More than happy to see that. All those in favour? Opposed? So carried. Right, this brings us to our first decision report, and this is the public transport advertising policy. You want to introduce these two?
Councillor, so this matter before you is a corporate WRC policy. This is the Strategy and Policy Committee, so it has been through an internal process, been through the executive. It is a policy that is required to assist our PT transport team with the contracting, the significant contracting that they will be doing later in the year. So the team have been very proactive and developed a policy of which there has been a vacuum to date to give some clarity going into those negotiations. It is something a little different that strategy and policy don't usually deal with these matters, but as you've done with dangerous dams, as you've had a look at navigation safety, it's one of those ones that is a corporate policy within the ambit of this committee. So we've got Trudy and Kana with us. I think Kana's a new employee or hasn't presented to the committee. Okay, Kana's been here for 4 years. I haven't met Kana. But there we go. So we will pass it over.
Thank you. Yep, if you can turn your mic on and we'll get underway. Thank you. Noting that it has been read by all councillors, I'm sure. So if you're going to outline the things, thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Tracy, for the introduction. So look, today we're here to present to you the advertising policy for adoption. Just as a little bit of background information, we have the regional transport policy called the RLTP. This sets out a policy that will has established that we can use the space on buses and public transport infrastructures to generate advertising revenue, and not so recently also with the PT rating model and the private share conversations that have been going on through the annual planning process. This is yet another avenue of revenue stream that we're looking to incorporate into that piece. With the the advertising policy, as Tracy has pointed out, we don't have one currently within WRC, so we're looking to have this adopted and it be one of the requirements within the RFT that goes out to market later this month to ensure that we have confidence that anything that is going on our bus backs is what we would expect and complying with the policy. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Kana, who will just give you a brief summary of the report, and then we'll open it to the floor for questions. There is a small presentation that we'll just run you through. It should only take us about 5 minutes. So thank you. Over to you, Kana.
Thank you, Trudy. Good morning, everyone. Bring the slides on the screen. So I just put up summary of the policy. It's very simple and straightforward summary. So why we need this policy? Currently, we have no advertising policy to regulate or control the contents of the advertisement that will appear on the bus or public transport infrastructure or facility that we control. And with this advertising policy, we can have high-level principle together with a decision-making framework regarding the approval of the contents. And next slide. The background, we have a regional public transport plan that set out a policy that we can generate revenue by selling advertising space on buses and the public transport infrastructure controlled by WRC. And I am currently preparing a request for proposal to find a suitable media agency who can manage and sell the advertising space on behalf of us. And we are going to the market very soon. And I'm sure this policy support us to go out the market and generate revenues. And next slide. So here is the list of the contents that will be excluded from advertising. So alcohol, gambling, and weapons, so it's quite straightforward and following the common sense. Next slide. When we have questionable material, we have decision-making framework. So media agency will inform us. Within WRC, we have 4 points of escalation. Firstly, our team will check the advertisement. And if we can't make a decision, we can escalate to manager Trudy. And then we could go legal team. Then finally, we get decision making from the director. So that's the main points of the advertising policy.
Thank you, Kana. Questions suit now? Good as gold. Noting your moving of this motion, Tipper. Clyde, come to you for a question.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Look, I asked for information about this policy and about current revenue, etc. But I was surprised to see that there was no policy in existence. So this is probably a good idea given the troubled times we're all going through. And I'd just like to say thanks to Phil and Tracy and you for providing that information in a very timely manner. So thanks for that. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you, Clyde. And I did have an email from Councillor Strange, and she's in support of this as well. So just so councillors and the minutes take note that Angela did email in support of this. Are there any other questions? Oh, sorry, Councillor Dunbar-Smith.
Oh, just in terms of the implementation, comes through us, comes to council. So at the end of this month, it's policy.
Yes, yep, that is the process. Councillor Hodge.
Morena korua. The question I'm going to ask is about what's on the buses now, the advertising on the buses now. If we are now doing a policy around the advertising, how did all those other advertising get on the bus? Where does that advertising money go now? So it seems to be, I know, a little bit backwards. We must have had something to allow that to happen already, or does it depend on who the contractors of the bus services?
Yeah, through the chair, just in response to date, the operators are in charge of any advertising that's going on to the back of the buses. That said, anything that's potentially questionable, that content is always being checked through WRC and sought approval. For example, some of those items, as we say, sort of common sense, alcohol, weaponry, those types of things, there's always, there's a process that underpins that. Just to give context, in the contracts that were tendered back in 2016, the advertising revenue arrangements had sat with the operators, and at a point in time, the contract has given the flexibility for council to procure the advertising space management at any given time. So at that point, the revenue split that's detailed in the RPTP, the 80% council, 20% operator would come into effect, but not until that time that we have someone on our behalf managing that process, if that makes sense.
Thanks for that. If there are no other questions, I'll just correct the record. Councillor Downer did move this as we opened. Councillor Mahuta was second. Thanks, Jordan. All those in favour? Opposed? So carried. Thank you, team. Right, we now move on to 7.2, which is on page 26 of your agenda. And this is the Waikato Regional Council submission to the Resource Management Consenting and Other System Changes Amendment Bill. There's quite a lot of technical detail in this, and we do have a number of staff members coming forward to present. Did you want to give an overview?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and Hamish and others. Tina's already there. Hamish, if you could just come up. So, councillors, this is another in the raft of what's coming out of central government. Again, pretty compressed time frame. Hats off to the team who made contact, first acknowledged that these are things that we want to get in front of you, but also made contact with the committee secretariat as the submissions closed on the 10th, said it's really important for us to put it in front of our councillors. May we have an extension? So we got that extension, which I think is great. As you will see in the report that Katrina has facilitated across the organisation, we really are focusing on the workability and functionality of the bill, really relying on a lot of those consenting matter experts, Hamish and Tina here helping us out in that space. There are some unfunded mandates that look to have crept in. We do not have fisheries management specialists here at the Regional Council. Some of those responsibilities, if they crept into us, into our business, you know, there's a conversation there. And we know that one of the things councillors are keen for us to keep our ears and eyes out are around the unfunded mandates. We are anticipating another maybe 1 or 2 amendment bills before we get into the wholesale amendment of the RMA. What this bill does is it actually puts back in some of the stuff that was taken out by the total repeal of the Natural and Built Environment and Spatial Planning Acts. When the government first came in that December, that was their phase 1. They've realised and subsequently talked to the sector and said, oh, crikey, we might have gone a little bit too far there. So let's put in some of the stuff that the sector found useful, but also here's some other things we're thinking about. So it is quite a technical submission, but I hope councillors will appreciate that staff have phrased the submission in words and vernacular that you've asked us to use. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Councillor Smith, did you have a question before we start?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to wait for clarification after the presentation.
Thank you. Right, all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Tracy, for that introduction.
Can I just get you to move that mic a little bit closer? Thank you.
So I'll begin this morning just by providing a short overview of the bill and where it fits within the government's resource management reform program, and we'll then move on to provide a summary of the key points in the draft submission for you. If we could just move the slide along, please. Following that, we'll be happy to take any questions from you. And as Tracy mentioned, I am joined by Tina and Hamish this morning, as well as a number of other staff in the room who have contributed and are able to assist with questions on their subject areas. So this bill is the second bill introduced by the government making targeted amendments to the Resource Management Act. The first was the Resource Management, Freshwater and Other Matters Amendment Act, which the council submitted on in June last year. That act was subsequently enacted in October of last year. Both of these amendment bills form part of the government's wider resource management reform program. As Tracy mentioned, there are still some steps to come in this, the two most significant being a suite of proposed new and amendments to existing national direction, which we're expecting to see for consultation in the coming months, and the second being full replacement of the RMA, which is signalled to occur later in the parliamentary term. Similar to the First Amendment Bill, this current bill proposes specific amendments to a range of existing sections of the RMA. The proposals have been grouped into 5 themes: infrastructure and energy, housing, farming and the primary sector, natural hazards and emergencies, and system improvements, which are mainly focused on resource consenting and enforcement. Under the infrastructure and energy theme, the key proposals include specifying a 1-year maximum processing timeframe for renewable electricity generation consents, establishing a default consent duration of 35 years for renewable energy and long-lived infrastructure, doubling the lapse period for designations and renewable energy consents, extending the duration of coastal permits for ports, and amending the scope of discharge rules under Section 70 of the RMA. Under the housing theme, the bill is mainly focused on providing a process for territorial authorities to alter or remove the medium density residential standards from their district plans. It also introduces some changes to the streamlined planning process and enables heritage buildings and structures to be delisted using that process. In terms of the primary sector theme, the bill proposes amendments to clarify the relationship between the RMA and Fisheries Act in relation to rules that control fishing, and provides for a change to national direction in relation to aquaculture consents. It also proposes amendments to certification and auditing processes for freshwater farm plans to allow industry organisations to deliver those services. In relation to natural hazards and emergencies, the bill introduces new regulation-making powers to support emergency responses, adds a new section to the RMA to enable councils to decline land use consents where significant natural hazard risks are present, and provides that natural hazard rules within plan changes will have immediate legal effect. Finally, the bill proposes a large number of amendments under the topic of system improvements. This includes amending the compliance regime by increasing penalties and enabling councils to recover monitoring costs for permitted activities, and enabling consideration of an applicant's compliance history in consent decisions. It also includes a range of changes aimed at simplifying the consenting regime. So turning now to the draft submission, the submission is generally supportive of the bill, but makes some recommendations to address issues with the bill as currently drafted. These, as Tracy said, are focused on improving workability, clarity, and certainty for local authorities. In preparing the draft submission, staff have worked with other organisations where the timeframes allowed, and the draft submission generally aligns with submissions from groups representing the local government sector and regional councils on most points. On page 28 of your agenda, the report provides a summary of the key amendments sought in the draft submission. I won't speak to all of these, but will highlight the main ones under each theme. So under the infrastructure and energy theme, the submission recommends an exception to the proposed 35-year consent duration for geothermal energy to recognise the complexity of geothermal resource management. It also recommends amendments to address identified issues with the proposed changes to Section 70 relating to rules about discharges, which staff consider are important to ensure the workability of this section. In terms of the housing theme, the submission seeks that changes related to heritage not be progressed as part of this bill until a suitable regulatory analysis is completed, and also recommends an amendment to enable the listing of heritage buildings and structures to occur using the streamlined planning process in addition to delisting. The submission also seeks that a proposed requirement that elected members cannot be appointed as commissioners to a streamlined planning process panel be deleted from the bill. Under the primary sector theme, it seeks that a requirement for additional assessment of proposed rules on fishing activities be deleted to recognise, as Tracy said, that regional councils don't hold information or expertise on fisheries management. The submission broadly supports the changes proposed to the freshwater farm plan system, subject to a number of recommended amendments to improve clarity, consistency, and support a more robust and credible system. In relation to natural hazards, the submission supports the clause enabling consent authorities to refuse land use consent based on assessment of risk from natural hazards, but does seek that a definition of significant risk be added to the RMA. And finally, on system improvements, the submission recommends a range of specific technical amendments to clauses relating to consent processing to improve clarity, consistency, and better align with practice. It specifically recommends that clause 34, which changes a consenting authority's obligation to hold a hearing, be deleted from the bill. This is due to a very significant change to submitter rights proposed, as well as a range of other issues identified with this clause. Overall, staff consider the amendments recommended in the draft submission will improve clarity and workability for future implementation of this bill. And that brings me to the end of my summary. Through you, Mr. Chair, we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Katrina. I'll start the questioning off and just jump in ahead of Noel. But my question's around the housing section. I like to see Waikato Regional Council stay within its lane. So just if someone can outline, obviously the MPS for urban development isn't out yet, as noted in the report. So just what relevance does this have basically on the housing and the urban development and also the heritage piece of that to regional council and the work we do?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I might answer the housing part of that question and then might throw to Alejandro to address the heritage aspect. So on the housing, there are quite limited changes within the bill on the housing topic because a lot of the detail in this area is yet to come in changes to the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. They have also, in the sort of grouping of the themes, some of the changes that sit under the housing theme, such as the streamlined planning process changes, are not strictly limited to housing. So the main changes in this bill on housing do relate to the medium density residential standards, which is primarily a territorial authority issue. So the submission is relatively light on that topic, but the one thing that it does recommend is just in relation to the process for territorial authorities to make minor amendments to the MDRS within their district plan. And that's just looking to provide a process that, I guess, is simple in practice for the TAs in the region, but ensuring that the changes still give effect to the MPSUD and also provisions that we have put within our regional policy statement to give effect to the MPSUD. So that's where that link comes in to our functions. And that point does also align with points made in the submissions of some of the Tier 1 territorial authorities within our region.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, the comment I was going to make is the last comment that Katrina landed on. We do have statutory responsibilities through our RPS in response to medium density provisions that provide the guidance to territorial authorities. So there is a cogency across the region in that regard. It wasn't part of the submission that staff spent a lot of time on, but just wanted to make sure that there was a knitting together of that national direction, the regional direction, and then down into territorial authorities. Similarly, I'll do a 2-for-1 special. We do have very light heritage responsibilities through our MPS as well. Those provisions came in for regional councils and RM amendment about 10 years ago. Again, it is very much a light touch, again, based on the rules around regional consistency. It is very much, heritage very much as a territorial authority function, but there are directions that are provided through our RPS at the moment. It is a document that we must ensure consistency with at the moment. We know that that may change. It is one of the things that the government's working on, but our our RPS does have those overarching heritage provisions. Same
Thank-
questions that I asked when I reviewed the submission.
Thank you, Tracy. We won't need to go to Alejandro for that heritage piece. No.
Thank you. Page 61.77, clause 65, penalties. I see the recommendation is to consider introducing minimum fines. As a judicial officer sitting in court, this issue was at forefront of my mind each time I sat on the bench. And the issue is that the judicial officer is required to consider any imposition of a fine greater than $250 and must take into the ability of the defendant to pay. The problem with minimum penalties is that that takes away the court's ability to look at that and review the circumstances of the individual or the organisation before the court. And that's why the Parliament has stayed away from imposing minimum fines, because in one case I can recall the defendant, to me, he should have been charged with a much higher offence, which I wouldn't have been able to deal with. But the reality was we didn't impose a fine because there was no ability to pay. He had become bankrupt, he had lost his business, and so we convicted with no fine. That enabled us to take into consideration the ability. So I would not support what point 77 is recommending, and I think we should take that out and leave it to the court's discretion as prescribed in legislation at the moment. Thank you. The minimum penalties, if you can't pay, what's the point?
Point noted. Staff, have a reply?
The only thing I would say on that point is we haven't specifically sought wording changes there. It is more just a suggestion that be considered, which is based on the reasoning provided in there, which did come from our RUD staff. But through you, Mr. Chair, if that's something that should be removed, we're happy to.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'm just concurring with what Katrina said. It is a consider. It's not saying we want you to, but it's just another tool in the toolbox that might be applicable in some instances. Totally understand what Councillor Smith is saying, but we don't know what instances appear. It is in an RMA frame, which is a little bit different. So we are saying, look, here's another tool in your toolbox. Don't rule it out. I guess that's what the submission point is saying.
Do we need some wording around that ability to pay, perhaps within that statement? Noting Councillor Smith's comments. Yeah.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, look, if we kept the submission point in, consider introducing minimal levels for fine, being cognizant of usual practice around assessing the ability to pay. Yep, more than happy to amend that.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Hughes.
Thanks, Chair Warren. A couple of questions. At the moment, you're recommending a default consent duration, or the bill recommends a consent duration of 35 years. Why aren't we suggesting life of asset consent? Once you put an asset in, you go consent covers the life of asset.
Kia ora. I'm Tina Warnock. I'm Principal RMA Advisor in the consent section. The term of a consent is related to the effects of an activity. So that is what the term is related to. The maximum is 35 years under the RMA. For that to be reassessed after that time. Yeah, I'm not aware of.
What my point is that we've got assets which have got useful lives between 60 and 80 years. Our infrastructure assets, all right? I can't see the point in having to go back and apply for a consent for the remaining 25, 35 years of that asset, because it's already there. It's doing its job. It's got a service level it's got to achieve. So what are we going to achieve by asking for it to be reconsented after 35 years?
Yeah, it's not something I thought of.
Yep. Bruce, can I just get you to clear your mic? Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah, no,
I've
good.
got you next.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So Councillor Hughes, the submission particularly relates to geothermal consents, and a lot can happen in a geothermal field in 5 years, let alone 35 years. So that's where we've specifically said, and this is on the basis of information that we've received, having looked at our consents, how they are processed, and what matters we bump into. And particularly in the geothermal area, 35 years is a long time. Other consents, as Tina said, the duration of the consent is related to the effects of that activity that's undertaken on that environment. Linking things to assets actually might not be smart, because we want to start looking at how the activity is operated prior to the cessation of that asset's life. So generally will want to do it at least 5 or 10 years beforehand. Many of the consents that we issue are for a 10 to 15 and beyond duration. I can't remember off the top of my head, but when we were looking at our submissions to the new aquaculture provisions, we have issued many for the utmost extent possible, given the effects of the activity. But a lot of things can change, a lot of technologies can change, so we don't recommend that everything has the default 35-year period.
Sorry, this, if I understand it correctly, relates to infrastructure and energy. Is that not right?
Yes, correct.
So therefore, our water protection assets, drainage protection assets would be included?
If they were covered by the definitions of infrastructure in the legislation.
Well, I assume they are.
Yes, they are, but not necessarily. They are if they are public, but if they are private assets, then they probably wouldn't be. Without having all that at my fingertips, I can't give you the assurance.
Well, I'll revert back to my original question. Why wouldn't we be going for life of assets for those infrastructure assets?
And exactly for why, the reasons that I outlined.
All right. So then my next question is in 12B, which is on page 42. This is relating to the geothermal. There's new technology which is currently being worked on, which you'll be aware, where they're drilling down to the Earth's, further down into the Earth's core, which means it's a continuously renewable resource. As they take the energy out, they replace it with water and it gets reheated. So are you suggesting that that will need to be reconsented every 5 years, because they're actually replacing water, or the steam, the energy that's coming out of the ground with water, which is converted back into energy. So one would expect that that's a continually renewable resource.
Through you, Mr. Chair, definitely not saying we'd only consent it for 5 years. What we're saying is we would consent commensurate with the impact of the effects of that activity on the environment. It's dependent on the nature of the activity, the technology, and whether it has impact or not. When we're dealing with the geothermal environment, it is so dynamic that 35 years, you would find that you've probably irreparably damaged that environment if we said that consent duration was 35 years. But I've not, in the conversations that I've had with our consenting folk, I don't think we've ever consented anything for 5 years. We are very mindful of the need for those operations to be able to be viable, and have very many extensive conversations with the operators. What we are asking for is flexibility in this provision.
Thanks, Tracy, because just common sense tells us as soon as we start adding costs to it, that's getting passed on to the consumer. So energy costs go up. And I'm a great believer in keeping things as simple as I've said here a number of occasions in recent times. Thank you.
Councillor Clarkson.
Yeah, I'm just seeking some clarification around the fisheries aspect. Why do you think this was proposed, this particular measure in relation to Section 32? I understand there's a potential overlap between Fisheries Act and RMA, but the question is why were they proposing this? Do you have any understanding at all about why they suggested this responsibility would come to regional councils?
I'll ask Chris State over there to speak to this one, if that's okay.
Tēnā koutou, kia ora. Thank you, Councillor Clarkson. That's an interesting question. I was ready to explain what these changes to section 32 to not so much restrict the ability of a regional council to put controls on fishing activities in a regional coastal plan, but just give us a really strangely convoluted process we'd have to go through if we wanted to. For the why, I have heard that Ministry of Primary Industries is looking at taking a larger role in coastal management. How that fits in with regional council responsibilities, we haven't had those discussions yet.
Just through the chair, I was just trying to scare up the forward to the bill, because that usually has the explanation as to why. It's not deep in this space, I'll be honest. Yeah, so we hadn't tested the why, we were just more about the crikey, what does it mean for us if this responsibility lands on us? But
Well,
we can have a look into that for you.
Yeah, well, because the reason I asked the question, I was trying to understand the logic about why the hell was the proposal made in the first place, because looking at it, I understand why you're taking away the unfunded mandate. Yeah, I agree, we don't want unfunded mandates, but I'm interested in knowing why, what is the motivation? Because, you would want the responsibility to lie where it should be best placed. Now, you've made some commentary in the document around the fact that we don't hold that sort of information. But has somebody in Ministry of Fisheries done a deal already? And why wouldn't they take that responsibility? That's the bit I just can't get my head around. Yeah.
I've managed to scare the provision up, Mr. Chair. So in the forward to the bill, the explanatory note, the bill clarifies the interface between the RMA and the Fisheries Act to balance marine protection with fishing rights. It means clarification and auditing of blah, 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 blah. That's not related to fisheries. The objective is to enhance investment certainty and support growth. That's in the forward. We will go back and ask for you.
Yeah, well, anyway,
best we can do.
See where I'm at here. It's like, I mean, why didn't, Fisheries New Zealand, or whatever they call themselves, they call themselves Fisheries New Zealand, don't they, in relation to this aspect? Yep. Clearly, they should have been the agency that would have the responsibility, and that's why I can't understand why this has even emerged. And I thought in your wording, you're perhaps not direct enough and just saying that MPI, Fisheries New Zealand, that should be their responsibility. Because they have all of the expertise in that space. Yeah. So anyway, it's a roundabout way of saying, I think what you've said is right, but you might want to be a little bit more direct about it, because the way you've written it is, it's got all that information about the Motiti decision and all the rest, but you've got to get to the point, Anyway, so, and that's why I asked the question about motivation. Is there something that is there some logical reason they've made the proposal? And I just can't see one. So I would have thought there might have been a logical reason. Anyway, that's enough on that. So you get where I'm coming from. Yeah.
Thanks, Bruce. Mikhail.
Yeah, my question is if the staff could just give me a briefing why in the natural hazards they've kind of asked for the definition of significant risk, and then also, which I do agree with, the material damage going to consequences on people, property and critical infrastructure. And if you could just give me the outline of why those words are used, and will it confuse, developers and stuff like that?
Certainly. I'll just get Alejandro to answer that question.
Kia ora koutou. Hal, thank you for the question. So just to make sure that I got the question correct. So you want to understand why we're asking for the change for material damage? Yes.
Can you use your mic?
Sorry, yeah, from the change to that to the people and a longer explanation. I'm just wondering, what's your thoughts of why you've expanded it? Will it make it more difficult or submit for submissions to go against, developers' properties? And the first one with the added from special hazards to significant risk.
Correct. To you, Mr. Chair. So I'll take the significant risk portion first. So this is something that is already in the Resource Management Act in Section 106. We have requested, so through council submissions in the proposed national policy statement, well, the very draft national policy statement for natural hazard decision making, we identified the lack of a definition of significant risk to be an issue. And that is because it sets a threshold, but it doesn't define it, which means that councils can have a very, say, varied way of approaching how to define it. So what we suggested then and what we're suggesting now is that it should be, if not defined, then at the very least framed, because once we have that consistency, it's better to apply. So if you were to look at how decisions for subdivision consent under Section 106 of the RMA are applied, is a bit of a kind of haphazard map when you look at it. In terms of the second part, if you focus too much on material damage, that ignores the fact that there are other parts of the environment effectively that get affected. And this is relevant for two reasons that we do as a regional council. So one is the civil defense and emergency management. So we look after more than buildings, but we also look after the people. And also we have to bear in mind that natural hazards also affect the receiving environment. So we may have ecosystem squeeze in some areas, for example, in the coast where you have development and erosion. So it eats up at the ecosystem effectively. And then if you consider all of those factors when you're assessing natural hazard risk for when you're doing land use, then it makes it more nuanced and better attuned to what's already on the land.
Yeah, no.
He's been waiting, Clyde, he's been waiting a while.
Clyde will be after you, Noel.
Okay.
In the order,
thanks. Just want to come back to what Chris was talking about, if I can. We have got significant infrastructure, certainly in the lower Waikato, some over on the Hauraki, but there's a lot being coming up for renewal now and in the next few years because of the end of life issues. Now, we've got some real concerns amongst the catchments that when we were looking to modernise, put a new pump in and infrastructure, like for like, pumping from the same place to the same place, that we're having to go through a complete renewal consent. So there is work already underway by certain individuals who have gone to their local MP, and that's now gone on to Chris Bishop, looking to get permitted activity status for the likes of renewal like for like. And that's basically a similar footprint within 20, 30 metres. Sometimes it's easier to build the new one while the other one's still working and then go for it. So my concern is it's what our community is asking us. It's what a number of councillors would like to see supported. And therefore, I appreciate, with greatest respect, Tracy, your role is to give us advice. But the reality is it's council's decision to decide what it wants to do. And I'm asking perhaps for a little bit of debate on whether we would ask under the infrastructure aspects, whether the replacement of a renewal like for like should be considered as part of the review of the infrastructure. And so, we can put our head in the sand. It's costing tens of thousands, and in some cases hundreds of thousands, to get consents. And recent example where at Churchill East, or a coffer dam, basically the water was stopped in the channel. It was pumped with diesel pumps around the work site and into the same place. It was from the stream, the channel, into the Waikato River, and consents had to be gained. It was doing the same job, but why? And so we had to represent the views and aspirations of our community. So for me, This is about, we've got an opportunity. Let's raise it and ask for it to be considered. Thank you.
So I'll come to Tracy for some comments back here.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess fully aware of the issues that you've raised here, Councillor Smith, and the challenges, the complexity of the challenges that sit in behind that. I would like to say I think we've learned an awful lot in the last decade around infrastructure and how it's consented. We've also learned a lot, and there are 3 key words in the RMA around scale, intensity and character. Same scale, intensity and character, effectively in layman's terms, more latitude, but things do change and things do need a fresh set of eyes. Also because the technology's changed, as you say, in fact, that what we use. From my perspective, I think what we're not saying in the submission, what we're saying, I should say, is we want the flexibility to make sure that the time, again, matches the bit of kit, the infrastructure. We don't believe it should be 35 years in all instances because, well, 2 reasons, and none of us will be here in 35 years processing the consents, but they may all fall on the same time. And is that wise? Having a staged approach means we can sit back, have a look at the catchments as a totality, and that might make sense. That's not to say that a 35-year consent would not be granted. We just don't believe that such a binary approach is wise, given all of our responsibilities and all our duties, not only to our landowners, but all our other members of the community to be able to participate. I understand what you're saying. I also would just say we need to be very cognizant of challenges that we may create, that in fact we are now holding on behalf of previous councils that are legacies that we've got. You know, many of the infrastructure that we had was always going to be in for a lifetime in 1970, and that lifetime is up. I think we've got smarter, and our ICM Directorate definitely are looking across that to actually understand what it looks like. My advice, and it is advice, the decision is council, is perhaps we could put some narrative in there explaining exactly what you just talked about, Councillor Smith, as to why we want the certainty of investment, but also are mindful that things change over that period.
Ben, can I get it?
The government itself is intervening through the mechanisms it's given itself to allow for doubling of various commercial activities, extending the life, etc. So I think Councillor Hughes has raised a good point in that we should look at, 35 is quite restrictive. There could be reviews built in. I'm happy to say that sort of issue is, but the reality is, let's get real. It's a huge investment, millions and millions of dollars. We've got one project at the moment looking to be more than 15 million. We've just done one that's 6 million. So this is not cheap stuff. If we could have that amendment, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy if Councillor Hughes may wish to comment.
Thank you. So I think we've noted down that we'll look at some wording around what you've articulated and Councillor Hughes has articulated and work that in.
Thank you.
Clyde, online.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just going back to geothermal consents, in regard to possible land subsidence, possible earthquakes to whatever degree, is there any monitoring done on that? And if so, who does the monitoring? Thanks.
Mr. Chair, thankfully we've had a late entry into the room from Director Sinclair. So Brent, I'm not sure if you're online, but there's been quite a bit of discussion around our submission point to the 35-year timeline and how we're wanting the flexibility, not such a binary instrument. And we've used geothermal as a case study. That's just a quick synopsis of the last 10-minute conversation. Over to you to answer Councillor Graf's question.
Oh, good morning, Clyde. Absolutely, there's quite extensive monitoring required of the geothermal operators around subsidence, changing water levels that impacts on geothermal features, and that is undertaken as a condition of consent of the consent holders, and then overseen and reviewed by peer review panels. So each of these significant operations has a peer review panel of experts that peer review and oversee the outcome of the monitoring data to then report back on, is everything happening as anticipated through the consent process. So if at some stage councillors are interested in seeing more around the monitoring of geothermal operations, how these peer review panels work, can absolutely bring that back through for your information.
Yeah, thank you, Brent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Clyde. Ben.
Two things. Firstly, on a lighthearted note, some of the younger members in this room may hope to be here in 35 years processing consent still. But I'm talking about. Just I wanted to talk about aquaculture, because obviously that's significant in our region, and also we are the major consent authority. The legislation provides for a change in national direction in relation to aquaculture consents, but I can't see we've referenced that at all in our submission. Are we in favour of it or not in favour of it, or where are we sitting?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. So we do have one point in the submission on aquaculture. It's point 47 in the table within the submission. So the aquaculture change proposed within this bill is relatively small because it is just providing for a national environmental standard to then set activity status for changes to consent conditions for aquaculture. So the bill itself is just providing for a future national environmental standard to do that, but the actual detail would come in a national environmental standard in a future process. So the submission supports the changes that are being made to the RMA, but then recommends that full engagement occurs with regional councils when it comes time to develop that NES, which would then have the details within it.
So this is not the RMA change that extended the consents to 35 years from. So okay, that's
not for aquaculture.
Thank you.
No.
It's gone through, yeah. Chris.
Oh, thanks, Mr. Chair. Just reverting back to Councillor Smith's suggestions. I'm just concerned about, we've got a level of service, right? So each catchment's given a level of service, X number of cubics they can take per annum out of the catchment, put it back into the river system. I don't see anywhere in here where we're actually accommodating the potential for increases in those, because the consents will be given for a certain volume of water to be taken annually. Do we have a provision in our consents for an uplift in that, given that we expect climate change to increase the level of water that's going to need to be removed from these catchments? Because one would not expect to have to go back to reconsent every time there's a change in the weather, which is requiring an increase in the level of service, which requires more cubics to be taken out of that particular area. So is there any way we can include that in these provisions? And if so, how would we accommodate that in our consents?
I would ask Director Sinclair to respond to that, because those three words of scale, intensity and character become very important, as well as a whole lot of other provisions that this bill isn't looking at. So I'll pass over to Brent.
Yeah, so Councillor, you raised one of the vexing resource management issues. So through our regional planning process, we identify what water is available to be allocated from various catchments. And then through the consenting process, we ensure that when people are seeking water, they're meeting the policy intent, which is around efficiency of use, so that there's water available, so people are using water efficiently, so there's water available for as many people as possible. The challenge that you identify is in future, if people need more water, how do they get more water when we have a policy framework which legislatively needs to set environmental limits? And so in so in practice, what happens is we review people's water usage, and if you're not needing to have that water, then your consents can be reviewed. So water will be reduced from one party so that water is available for others, but you do sit inside a cap that's set by the regional plan.
Sorry, maybe I didn't express myself very clearly. I'm talking about the opposite. This is where we're going to be putting more water back into the catchment, not taking it out. In other words, you've got a catchment that's got a certain consented amount, volume of water which they're allowed to put back in the river system. Because I'm being hypothetical, climate change may require that volume of water to be changed the upside, not the down. So you're going to have more water to deal with. So I just want to make sure that our consenting process will accommodate that without creating a huge issue for holders of the consent. They can actually have their consent bounce on top of what it is, 10%, 20%, whatever it might be, before it triggers a need to review the consent.
Yeah, so it depends on what situation you're talking about, Councillor. If you're talking about a territorial authority who is discharging a volume of wastewater into a river, which is a discharge, and then they are capped on the amount that they're allowed to discharge based on the assessment of effects side of the impact of that volume of wastewater and the contaminants that's contained within it. If you're describing a situation of a flooding situation where you're looking to get water off land, so you'll see right now that the regional plan has permissive rules around whatever water needs to get off the land can get taken off the land. They don't have consents which limit the volume. It's about being able to undertake the activity of drainage and then of flood protection. So I don't think the legislation needs to do anything to enable things that the plan is already has the ability to do. Over to you, Trace.
So there's no upper limit in terms of the amount of water taken off a particular catchment, put back into the rivers.
So so right now our planning framework is quite permissive in that space. If the planning framework required permits, then you would put in place a permit that met the needs of that permit. So that's what you do at the beginning of any consenting process. What is it that we want to do? Identify what you want to do, what the impacts of what that might be. So I think people who look after the plan more than me will know that the flood rules right now enable you to take water and put it into another floods into the river, and there aren't limits on that.
Thanks, Brendan. I think Tracy's got a supplementary.
Yeah, just really reiterating, in terms of the submission, that is something that definitely is a conversation in our regional plan and our regional plan review. It's a detail that I wouldn't put in this submission, but I think what we can do is put in a hook to just ensure that there is clarity for regional plan development.
Thank you. Any other questions? Right, there is a motion before us, and we have noted 3 items that will come back through myself and Tracy as we move forward. So, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, if I can just get councillors understanding what those 3 items are. One is in regard to submission point 77, which is around the penalties, and the conversation we had there linking that some narrative around present normal practice and assessing the ability to pay. The other is around clause 46 in regard to fisheries, and just be a bit more direct in terms of that is the responsibility of another agency and should squarely fit with them. And then the conversation that we've been having around clause 39 and that certainty of investment, acknowledging the government has also made some significant investments in our infrastructure recently. That need for those reviews, linkage to cumulative effects, and that hook into clarity for the regional plan.
Sounds like you've captured it all. Thank you, Tracy. Number 2 will drop down to 2.2. Come back, yeah. A mover, happy to move. Thank you, Councillor Smith. Happy to second, Councillor Clarkson. I did have first. All those in favour? Opposed? So carried. Thank you. I'd just like to thank staff for a very comprehensive and clear report. Thank you very much. And also councillors for actually spending the time and doing the homework and coming armed with the right questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, we now move on to 7.3, which is page 64 in your agenda. This is the Waikato Regional Council submission on Local Government Water Services Bill. This is also a decision before us.
Through you, Mr. Chair, we have tried as much as possible to stick within our lane, focus on our roles and responsibilities in regard to water management. We have our territorial authorities who are more significantly impacted by this bill than us. As we've said there, again, we are related to consent duration. So Tina and Brent, the same conversation again. And the prevalence, really those key issues of these rules and performance standards that may cut across the conversations we've actually had with our community and what they are requiring in our regional plan, also acknowledging Te Ture Whaimana and its primacy for a third of our region. Over to you, Alejandro.
Just before you start, Alejandro, Tipper, you've got your hand up.
I was just checking I had up in the last 2 as well, so I'll wait for my turn, but thank you. Just making sure you can see me.
Yes, thank you, Jordan.
I moved the first resolution, it wasn't noted. I tried to speak in the last debate, so I'll just make sure I'll yell. Thank you. Kia ora, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Leandro.
Tēnā koutou katoa e kārai aho te tima, whakatina nāku papahere, ko Alejandro Fuentes tōku ingoa. Good morning to you all. Alejandro Fuentes, the team leader for policy implementation. So I'll be talking to you about the draft submission on the bill for local government water services. This bill is currently with the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee. It was referred at the end of last year, in 17th of December, and the submissions closed on the 23rd of February this year. You will find information in the governance report in pages 64 to 68 of your agenda pack, and the submission draft in pages 69 to 83. This bill is the third stage of the local water zone well work program that the government set out for themselves. And what it does is establishing enduring settings. So this is essentially the replacement of the old system with some new features. The draft submission is overall supportive of the objectives of the bill. So this is if you look at paragraph 3 of your governance report, that is in essentially first page 64, is to ensure that the water services are safe, reliable, environmentally resilient, customer responsive, and deliver at the least cost to consumers and businesses. However, as Tracy noted, our submission focuses on the impacts of this bill on the roles and responsibilities that we have under the Resource Management Act as a consenting authority. And this is related to the impacts that it has on our functions, but also on matters related to natural justice. If you look at page 66 of your report, that in paragraph 10, we've summarized the main issues. So that is essentially the key points of the submission. So we've made 4 key points related to consent duration and the direction for environmental performance standards to prevail over Resource Management Act rules. Then this, as a result, we identified a negative impact on Te Ture Whaimana o Te Awa o Te Waikato, the vision and strategy for the Waikato River, which is part of the Waikato Regional Policy Statement. Some changes to the consent process that related to notification, restriction on conditions, and limitations to apply sections 105 and 107 of the Resource Management Act, and some unfunded mandates that we've highlighted. Just for reference, sections 105 and 107 refer to matters relevant to certain applications for discharge, consents and coastal permits, so that's something that we do. And 107 refers to restriction on grant of certain discharge permits, which is something that we do as well. Lastly, we noted the lack of future climate change orientation of the provisions in this bill. The key submission points, and they're explained in more detail in the submission, so that's page 70 of your agenda pack. One thing that we wanted to do was we kind of themed it in a way that was easy to pass the message on as to what we were concerned. So we based these headings on the explanatory portion of the bill itself. So comments on a new single standard for wastewater and stormwater for environmental performance standards. Largely, all of the changes to the RMA were unsupported in the evidence that was provided with the bill. So we were unable to see full detail and full analysis of the impact on their regulatory rules of regional councils by the introduction of many of these provisions. And it was also a change of direction from the Water Services Act. So this council in previous triennium submitted to changes to the water services regime. And one of the things that we identified is that the system of water services remain contained to deal with the matter that is to the operators of those parts of the infrastructure and those parts of the operation. However, this is a spillover and this is an overreach that we identified with new provisions. This impacts, as I mentioned, the 2 to 5 mana and also creates some onerous obligations for regional councils. We also questioned the 35-year consent duration and the duration relating to the Resource Management Act in terms of climate change. Further, we provided some common and specific clauses. So this is in pages 77 to 83 of your agenda pack. This is just a table with submissions. So it's the normal clause by clause analysis that we do with specific submissions. It's technical in nature, but we reiterated some of the points, well, all of the points that we raised in the initial part of the submission that I just highlighted. With that, I'm happy to take questions to you, Mr. Chair.
Tracy, there's an additional comment?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'm just wondering, given that we've had that conversation on consent duration, whether we lift up the same comments that we had in the previous conversation and just apply those to this submission as well to make sure that our messaging is consistent and we're picking up the conversation.
Thank you, Tracy. Yeah. Tipper, noting that you're moving this motion. Are there any other questions? The second for the motion. Thank you, Councillor Hughes. All those in favour? Aye. Opposed? So carried. Thank you very much.
So this is a pretty straightforward plan change submission with 2 matters in here. What has happened, if those councillors who are aware, Councillor Smith will be very cognizant of plan changes. We've submitted on this plan change what South Waikato have come back and done and said, oh, well, what we had put out for a plan change, we want to kind of swap things around. So that sounds good, and it sounds good, okay, the same amount of hectareage, excellent, but what we've actually got now is what was residential and industrial. When you swap those around, suddenly you start to have to look at things a bit differently. And our ICM directorate have kind of gone, oh, actually we need to have another look at this. It's not quite as simple as a boundary adjustment. So over to you, good self, JP.
Kia ora koutou. Good morning, Chair and Councillors. Yeah, thanks for the explanation, Tracy, and introduction. So yeah, I'll just give you a short overview of the application and the submission. So the South Waikato District Council is inviting submissions on a plan change request. The proposal seeks to realign an area of 40 hectares of commercial zone and to relocate an area of 7,500 square meters of residential zone into the rural zone. The applicant raised that both these areas were rezoned back in 2021 as a result from a previous plan change. And this new proposal only concerns boundary adjustments, as there wouldn't be any changes to the size of the areas to be changed. However, staff consider that the proposed boundary adjustments will result in rezonings of land, including new rezonings of highly productive land. And the application does not consider the effects from the rezonings. So therefore, we consider that this proposal should be properly assessed, considering the proposed changes as rezonings instead of boundary adjustments, and that the applicant should prepare the relevant assessments, including assessments under the regional policy statement and the NPS for highly productive land. Further, we have identified a potential risk of flooding at the proposed site for relocating the portion of the residential zone at the end of Totari Street in Putaruru. The flow path draining from the catchment passes through the lower part of the site, and that goes on the path of where they're trying to put the residential zone. So as a result from these concerns, the draft submission in summary recommends that the new rezonings of HPL, of highly productive land, are properly assessed under the NPS HPL and RPS, and that the flooding study is prepared to assess the potential flooding risks at the proposed area for relocating the portion of the residential zone. I'm happy to provide more detail or to answer any questions.
Thank you, JP. Just one question from me. When you're considering the changes to highly productive land, is there any difference between it being commercial or being residential?
No, they're both considered as urban zones.
Okay. So to me, that would rule out our concern that you're relooking at an activity on highly productive land, because I mean it was zoned commercial. They're now looking to shift that piece of residential into that commercial space. But if there is no different considerations between commercial on highly productive land or residential on highly productive land, the argument is moot.
Yes, but what they're doing, like, because there's a commercial, the 40 hectares of commercial zone, they are changing it to rural. And so between the two growth cells, there's a rural area that it's all highly productive land. There's a little bit of rural residential, and then you have the residential. So they are taking a portion of the residential here and putting on the rural and turning this here back to rural. So we have concerns like when they're turning the land back to rural, what will be the effects? Because then you're actually having rural land in between rural residential and residential. So what would be reverse sensitivity? Would that area actually be suited for rural purposes, for land-based primary production? But in terms of the commercial, then yes, they are encroaching again into the rural and giving it back. But yes, to answer your question, it doesn't really matter if it's commercial or residential.
And the existing land at the moment is rural.
Yes, where they're trying to move the residential is rural, and where they're also moving the commercial is also rural.
Yeah,
it's a bit confusing.
I'm finding this confusing.
Yeah.
And could you go to the photographs and maps that explain?
Yes.
I do note, however, though, that there's a potential flooding risk, which is obviously something we would be concerned about.
Yeah. So if you look on page 101 of your agenda, you see the current zoning. So the area in red here with the blue around it, that's the commercial. And if you look on your left, there's a yellow area, that's the residential area. And also there's a square highlighted in blue. And then if you move to page 110, you can see the proposed adjustments. So they changed the shape of the commercial and moved that square up to the rural.
Yeah.
So it is swapping land and it's the same size, but we just think that they need to do the assessments so we can fully understand the effects of the changes. Yeah,
Go-
yeah, the applicant, yeah.
oh, thank you, Councillor Downer. Councillor Hughes. you have a
I'm
question?
happy to second, but I am concerned about the flood risk. To me, we've had this example out here at Te Kauai where we've got a similar situation, and I just don't want us to see us replicating that and putting future residents, urban residents under the same risk. So as long as we can mitigate that risk, then I'm happy with it.
Yeah, I think that's a concern of most councillors around the table, if not all councillors around the table, that potential flooding risk in that residential area. Ben.
I was just going to invite Katarina if she's got any comments. No, given that you know the area better than anyone.
Yeah.
I find it, I've seen the write-up there from the local perspective, so I can't comment. I just find it strange that we think there's a flooding potential there when there's no flooding now, the way it is. So why would it become, if you change the zoning, would it become a potential flooding when nothing's happening at the moment in the many years I've been involved in? So what will change that potential from non-flooding to a flooding risk?
Yes, the concern here is because the location there, it's a short catchment and it's bounded by State Highway 1 on the top. So, and the State Highway, so it's higher. So if on the case of a significant event, like the flow path will go through where they're proposing to put the new residential houses, which will be around 11 houses. So it's a concern, it's a risk, but we don't know for sure, like if it will flood or not. So we are only asking them to assess, and if there's a risk, to mitigate it.
Yeah, councillors, if I can make the comment, I mean, it's exactly what Councillor Hughes said. While it looks minuscule, swapping a block that page 110, if you go over to page 113, you'll see the lots that are proposed there. The Te Kōwhai issue is in everyone's mind, and while it might be a simple change of title, it is a short catchment. We don't want in terms of dynamics.
Thank you, Tracy. And to Katarina's point, I think it's probably good as regional council, we raise this with South Waikato and then the ball's back in their court, yeah.
Yeah, and rain falling on pasture is completely different to roofs and concrete.
Yeah. You have an additional question or comment, Noel?
Yes, I did have a question. Sorry, I wanted to raise some information, right? You talked about Te Kōwhai yesterday at the Lower Waikato subcommittee, catchment subcommittee. We've got a number of patches around the region that are causing significant issue where urbanisation has gone out into rural drainage networks. We've asked that staff progress the likes of Te Kōwhai to get a precedent of how we can manage moving these back to the districts, because it's all right knowing about them, but what are we doing about them? So staff have agreed to look at one. Te Kōwhai is the primary goal, but if there's another one we can get the process sorted. So it's just for information, really. Thanks.
Thank you. Did you want to comment, Tracy, before we?
Yeah, I did. I just want to make a comment, just so councillors are aware, when plan changes come through, this is our first opportunity to get this right. So these plan changes are effectively saying, we now believe this bit of land is the right bit of land for commercial, industrial, residential, rural residential, whatever they want to call it. It is now where we do need to start identifying these matters, because what comes next is the consent. The plan change is already pretty much inferred, yes, we expect this activity, and you can't rezone a bit of land such that the consent comes next, and you attach so many onerous conditions that people can't build. So this is where we get it right. This is why, and this ultimately the decision is the territorial authorities. But if we feel so strongly about it, we will appeal. And we have appealed some where the where we don't want these legacy issues either now, 10 or 20 years in the future. And that's why sometimes things get uncomfortable in the appeal stage, because we are sitting there advocating very strongly for a position. So I just wanted to make councils aware it's at these plan changes. Sometimes we're invited in earlier master plans where we can help, but this is when we must get it right. Thank you.
Just
Thanks. Yes,
Mr.
sorry,
Chairman,
Mikhail.
I'd just like to endorse what Tracy said, because I know even in our area, with this plan change one, we've got a lot of rural, what do they call them, small blocks that are now in fear of them dividing them into smaller sections where the infrastructure and the environment just does not, suit that. So I hope with what Tracy said that, there is a way of this Waikato Regional Council coming in and making submissions to these TAs to say, hey, we don't think that's appropriate for reasons why.
Thank you. The motion before us, as you see, there's no need for point 3, as we are not altering anything. So Mikhail has moved, Chris has seconded. All those in favour? Aye. Opposed? So carried. Thank you, JP. We'll now take a 5-minute break. So please be prompt on your return.